Evening, folks. I am putting together this little lesson for you all for while I am away. I'm saying good evening. I don't know what time you're watching this. It's evening for me. But in any case, though, just kind of want to pick up where we left off the other day. I may not get as far as I would otherwise like. This may be a little bit shorter than a standard class size of 50 minutes, simply because we were kind of creeping up on the end of our discussion of mechanisms of microevolution. So I may not go the full time, but I hope you're all okay with that. This is also a topic, we're getting into some things that I really like to discuss in lecture. I'm actually kind of sad that we're making this a lecture that you're going to watch remotely when we can't have a give and take conversation about it. So what I want you guys to be doing as we proceed with this little lesson here, take some notes on it, pay attention to it. If you have questions about it, write them down. Be ready to ask them when we get back to class on Monday, because this is some really important concepts, some really crucial stuff in evolution, and I don't like the idea that we won't have a discussion about it. So let's be ready to have a little bit of a conversation about that when I return to Pittsburgh. But in the meantime, I'm going to give you the fundamentals. So we left off the other day. We were talking about mechanisms of natural selection. We were taking a look at the various ways selection can modify populations. We looked at the differences between relative fitness and evolutionary fitness. We talked about some of the environmental factors that can affect fitness and the whole problem of working on the whole phenotype of the organism, not just the individual gene. We also talked a little bit about ways that selection can change populations, disrupting selection where a particular kind of gene is favored over all other options, disrupting selection in which you have basically two stable phenotypes maintained in the population for different reasons, and of course balancing selection or stabilizing selection, in which you end up with one middle ground trait that is favored over all of the alternative possibilities. By the way, I forgot to say this at the beginning. Since I don't have a means of drawing diagrams, I'm doing this from my house. I don't have a whiteboard here at home. I'm going to recommend that as you listen to this, you might want to follow along in your textbook in the chapter on population genetics. I think it's chapter 23, because then you'll get some terms possibly that I'm introducing here, and you might get some helpful diagrams here and there. Although I'm going to tell you right now, some of what I'm going to talk about is not in the textbook, in particular in this section, because it represents some really cool research that your text frankly doesn't go into as much detail as I would like. But I'm going to give you guys the fuller picture. Now, we left off saying a few words about reasons variation is maintained, why there's still variation in a population despite the fact that selection tends to favor one trait over another. And you might reasonably ask yourself, why would this be? Why would variation persist under those circumstances? Why have all the less favorable variants not long since been weeded out by selection? You guys gave me a few really good reasons for that in class the other day. We talked about the fact that if you have a recessive gene, you tend to stay in populations no matter how harmful you are, because there are always more carriers who aren't expressing than affected individuals who are expressing. We know that sometimes a random mutation can introduce a novel gene into a gene pool. Nothing you can do about that. Sometimes variation can be maintained by a thing called environmental heterogeneity. We talked about that the other day, which means that the population is keeping around more than one stable phenotype for a reason, like the peppered moths that we talked about. We know that sometimes if a trait is neutral or nearly neutral, it can persist quite readily. It's just along for the ride with other traits. Our Red Queen model tells us that sexually reproducing populations can maintain variation for future use simply by the means of carrying the genes and then having an environment change in a way that makes that gene useful. We talked about heterozygote advantage, the fact that sometimes it's beneficial to have one copy of a gene instead of 0 or 2 copies. Like the sickle cell gene, one copy gives you gives you malaria resistance without sickle cell anemia. 2 copies, you get malaria resistance, but you also have sickle cell anemia. 0 copies, you get no malaria resistance, but you also don't get sickle cell anemia. The best option is to have one copy of that gene if you live in a malaria-prone area. We talked about the possibility of a gene not hurting you until you're past reproductive age, and therefore selection doesn't act against it, and so that maintains variation. And we talked about the possibility of a gene that is going to not affect you badly enough to give you a fitness of 0. Like, for example, the possibility of a gene that might kill you young, but it doesn't kill you too young to reproduce. And as a result, you might have a shorter lifespan. Sickle cell anemia, if you have sickle cell anemia, you'll probably die by middle age, but you'll have reproductive opportunity before that, you know. Or if it's something like, I'm going to pick on you again, Emily, you know, that gene that your grandma had, you know, that is carried in your family that leads to more frequent miscarriage. She had lost a lot of possible kids to miscarriage, but she also had a lot of kids because she did reproduce despite the fact that her fitness was technically being cut by the presence of that gene. Now, we finished by saying a few things about frequency-dependent selection. And let me tell you, by the way, frequency-dependent selection and environmental heterogeneity are both examples of what's sometimes called balancing selection, situation in which selection maintains a balance of more than one trait in the population for some reason. And environmental heterogeneity is a chief cause of that different morphs are fulfilling different roles in the environment, and as a result, they stick around. Now, we talked at the end there, though, about frequency-dependent selection, in which a trait is particularly valuable if it is common or particularly valuable if it is rare. Now, positive frequency-dependent selection is the example we gave in class the other day. It's a situation in which a trait is only valuable as long as it is common. If it's not sufficiently common in the species, the advantage goes away. We talked about aposematic coloration, A-P-O-S-E-M-A-T-I-C, aposematic, which is protective coloration. Warning colors that basically say to a predator, hey, if you try to eat me, I'm going to taste bad, or I'm going to be toxic and poison you, or make you hallucinate, or whatever. A lot of frogs, like the poison dart frogs that we find in the Amazon rainforest, have aposematic coloration, really brilliant, bright colors that would ordinarily make them stand out very well for predators, but the predator knows that that bright color means don't eat that frog or you're going to die. Now, the problem here for the organism comes if that color is rare. Aposematic coloration is only useful if a majority of the population has it. If it's too rare of a feature, it will not act as an effective warning for the average frog. And the predators won't learn to associate that color with death if that color is going to be only found in a minority of the population. It won't be an effective deterrent in that case. That's positive frequency-dependent selection. Trait is useful if it's common. Now, one of my favorite evolutionary phenomena, and I love this one, is a trait that is only useful if it is rare. Frequency-dependent selection that is negative frequency-dependent selection. Trait loses its utility if it's too common in the population. Classic example, and this one might surprise you guys to hear this, of a trait that is only useful as long as it's rare, psychopathy. Now, you hear psychopath. We use the word psychopath in day-to-day life in a very colloquial sort of way to mean a bad person or an evil person or a crazy person is what we would say. You're a psychopath, right? But psychopathy has a very specific biological meaning. If you are a psychopath, and spelling of that, P-S-Y-C-H-O-P-A-T-H, psychopathy is a genetic condition. It's an inherited condition in which you are genetically incapable of feeling empathy. That's what it means to be a psychopath at a biological level. You are genetically unequipped to feel empathy. This is a genetic condition. It's a recessive condition. Now, here's the thing about this, folks. Psychopathy is clearly a thing that you would say, why is that helpful? That's not good to be a psychopath. But here's the thing. We are a social animal. Homo sapiens evolved to live in groups. And a lot of our adaptations are social adaptations, everything from the signaling mechanism of facial expressions to the pheromones, the chemical scents that we give off. That's all part of living in groups. It's biological adaptations to functioning around your fellow apes. Now, behavioral genetics can be a factor here as well. Certain behaviors are genetically hard-coded, and as a result, you can have a behavioral adaptation. Now, empathy is an essential behavioral adaptation for living in a group. It means that you recognize that other organisms like you experience the world the way that you do. It's a thing called theory of mind in psychology, the recognition that another organism has a mind like yours, and therefore they think about things the way that you do, they have beliefs and opinions like you do, they have their own thoughts, their own inner life. If you are a social animal, a requirement of being a social animal and cooperating with your fellow social animals is the recognition that they are beings like you, that they have thoughts, that they have feelings, that they have an inner life as you do, and that they are therefore experiencing the world the way you are, at least in some important respects. In other words, you will recognize, hey, that thing is causing pain to me, it will therefore also cause pain to you, and therefore I might want to help you avoid that thing. Or I experience hunger when I don't get enough food. My buddy over here, my fellow ape, has not had anything to eat. I know that that's hungry. I know that that's a bad experience. Maybe I'll help you get some food. These are all things that make social cooperation possible. Cooperation isn't possible without the recognition that that other organism has things in common with you and would therefore want and need the same kind of things that you want and need. The acknowledgement that they have an inner mind that is like your inner mind. It's the basis not only of cooperation, but really at the end of the day, it's the basis of morality. Every moral system on earth basically teaches something along the lines of take care of your fellows because they are like you in some fashion. They have an inner life like yours, and we recognize that. Now, if you don't have empathy, if you are genetically incapable of that experience, if you are emotionally blind and unable to recognize that your fellow humans feel things that you feel, let's think about this for a minute. Sounds like a big problem in a social environment, right? Now let's imagine for a second. Let's imagine I'm going to plot out a graph that you can't see right here. In the upper right-hand quadrant of the graph, actually, let's back up for a second. Y-axis of our graph, vertical axis of our graph, is going to be plotting behavioral utility in terms of how much does this behavior benefit me versus how much does it harm me. We could say y-axis going above 0, that is the higher up I go, the more the behavior benefits me. If the y-axis goes down below 0, that's the more that behavior benefits you. Likewise, let's look at our x-axis. The more our x-axis moves towards the right, that means that that is behavior that is... Okay, I messed this analogy up. Forgive me, guys. It's late at night. Give me a second here. I'm actually just going to draw a quick little diagram for you all here. Hold on one sec. All right, I'm back here. So I've created a little graph here to help illustrate the point I'm going to make, in which we're plotting human behaviors on an axis of how much the behavior helps me versus harming me on our y-axis, and how much that behavior helps you versus harming you on the x-axis. See the diagram that I've got going on here. Oh, hell, that's backwards, isn't it? That's mirror image. I didn't anticipate that. All right. But you can see the basic architecture of this, right? Even if the words are backwards, that the higher up we go on the y-axis, the more helpful the behavior is to me. The lower we go on the y-axis, the more harmful the behavior is to me. Likewise, on the x-axis, the further right we go, the more the behavior is helpful to you. The more on the x-axis we go to the left, the more the behavior is harmful to you. Now I'm going to take that diagram now because it's not really particularly helpful if it's mirror image. But let's think about this for a moment. Let's suppose a behavior is in the quadrant of the graph, upper right quadrant of the graph, where it's both helpful to me and helpful to you. That behavior is what we would call a cooperative behavior. Anything in that axis of the graph that helps both you and me, that's a cooperative behavior. In social animals, cooperative behaviors are strongly favored by natural selection because they mean that both organisms in the social group are going to do better for themselves. They're going to benefit from that cooperation. So natural selection has strongly favored genetics and behavioral features that cause us to help one another. That's useful stuff. Now let's go down to the lower right quadrant of the graph. a behavior that is helpful to you but harmful to me. A thing that if I do it, I'm going to suffer, but you're going to benefit. That is what we would call an altruistic behavior, a behavior that costs me something for somebody else to gain the benefit. Now, altruism is one of those things that is only evolutionarily helpful in certain particular instances. Specifically, altruism is evolutionarily helpful if the individual you are helping shares your DNA. In other words, a sibling, parents, a cousin, a child. Because what's going on in that instance is that even if you are suffering, if your fitness is being reduced by the behavior you're engaging in, if you're giving up resources, if you're putting yourself in danger, classic example, throwing yourself in front of a moving car to save your child or whatever, what's happening there is that at an evolutionary level, yeah, maybe you're taken out by that. Maybe your fitness is reduced by that. Maybe you're eliminated from the gene pool by that. But you have perpetuated the DNA that you share with that other individual. Remember the whole point of natural selection. Get your DNA into the next generation, right? Your DNA doesn't care if it gets into the next generation through you or through a relative of yours. It's the same DNA. And as a result, we are going to tend to exhibit altruistic behaviors with regards to individuals who share DNA with us. You are way more likely to exhibit altruism towards your child than anyone else, because your child got half their DNA from you. Genetically, they're half you. Likewise, parents. Your parents have half your DNA. Your siblings have half your DNA. Your cousins, a little bit less. Your uncles and aunts, a little bit less. We have a tendency to value relationships, and we may not realize we're doing this, but in nearly every society, genetic close relationships are given more value than genetically far relationships or relationships that aren't genetic at all. Make a distinction between family and friends for a reason. Now, yes, I know a lot of people, myself included, have an attitude that friends are family, and a lot of people will, in fact, give up a lot to protect their friends and the people they care about who aren't their relatives at all. Or you might have a cousin who's like a sister to you, But at the same time, you will find that overall, when you look at human behavior globally speaking, people are way more likely to sacrifice for their child, their sibling, their parents, or other close blood relative than they are for a stranger or a friend. Not to say that you can't give up your life for a stranger, not to say that you can't treat a friend like a family member. All those psychological mechanisms that we have built in to say to do those kind of behaviors can be hacked by a society that makes us treat those people as the equivalent of relatives, and makes us think of those individuals as family. Then they get slotted into the same behavioral pattern that says protect yourself for blood kin. But in general, I think you'll agree, most people are going to be more likely to sacrifice for their kid than they are for their buddy. So that's altruistic behavior, and it's only favored by selection if the individual you're sacrificing for has some of the same DNA that you do. And the more their DNA they share, the more likely you are to make that sacrifice. Let's flip this around. Upper left quadrant of that graph. Behaviors that are helpful to me but harmful to you. That's selfish behavior. In a social animal, selfish behavior is strongly selected against for the simple reason that it's taking resources and it's breaking the fundamental cooperation that social animals need to function. It means that you are an animal that is taking something from the cooperative group without giving something in return. You're cheating the social contract, right? There is a reason why basically every moral system on Earth has standards that say that selfishness is bad, that stealing is bad, that taking things from other people to benefit you is a bad thing to do. Because that's built into our DNA at a very literal level, that we have this behavioral coding that says that selfish behavior is harmful. It may help you in the short term, but as a social animal, it means you're more likely to be ostracized. And this isn't just humans. Look at social chimpanzees. You'll find that the chimp who steals food from other chimps, the other chimps start avoiding that chimp. They start withholding food from them. They don't mate with them as often. They get ostracized. So at the end of the day, selfish behaviors tend not to be favored by natural selection, at least in cooperative animals. It doesn't mean that they don't happen, because selfish behavior can definitely net you a temporary edge, but over the long haul, selection tends to work against them. Lower left-hand quadrant of the graph is spiteful behavior. Spiteful behavior is a big evolutionary puzzle, because spiteful behavior is harmful to both me and you. I am harming myself to harm you. By definition, spiteful behavior benefits no one. It's behavior that both parties involved are going to be hurt by. No one wins. At a natural selection level, you can see that evolution would strongly not favor spite. Spite would be disfavored in basically all instances. There are exactly three known species. Three known species that are known to exhibit spite. Humans, chimpanzees, dogs. We have no idea why spite has persisted in the evolutionary record. The persistence of spite as a behavioral pattern is a complete mystery. But that's a puzzle for another day, because I can't really address that. We don't know why spite has stuck around, or whether it's stuck around because of recessive factors or something like that. But what I can say, let's spin back to sociopathy here. Your sociopath does not feel empathy. Your sociopath is genetically incapable of recognizing the inner lives of other individuals. You can see some chilling interviews with sociopaths who will say, well, yes, I recognize that you think that you're important, and things like that. The sociopaths simply sound like an evil, horrible asshole of a person when they say that, and maybe they are kind of evil by our standards of morality, but it's not chosen evil. It is an individual who literally is not able to feel empathy. Now, here's the thing. I said that this was a psychopathy, sociopathy. Those terms get interchangeably used in psychology. I'm going to probably be swapping them back and forth in our discussion here. But the thing about this, folks, is that the sociopath cheats the social contract. They don't feel that empathy. They have no conscience telling them not to do the selfish thing. Now, a stupid sociopath quickly eliminates themselves from the gene pool. A sociopath that is not clever about it will be recognized as a cheat very quickly on. Sociopaths that are not good at concealing their behavior or motives tends to have a bad time of it. These are the ones that get institutionalized when they're kids because they smothered their baby sister with a pillow because they didn't like the noise she was making, or they decided to slice open the dog to find out how it worked. These are the ones that can't function in real life, you might say. But let's talk about your smart sociopath. There's a reason psychopathy and sociopathy are positively correlated with high intelligence, and that's because only the smart ones make it for any length of time. If you are a smart sociopath and you figure out that your fellow apes believe in this thing called cooperation and care about one another's imaginary feelings that you don't experience, and behave as if each other's needs mattered, whenever you know very well that their needs don't matter because you don't feel their needs. You don't recognize that they feel what you feel. But if you're smart enough to work that out intellectually and think, okay, even if I don't believe these other beings around me have a true inner life, and I can't experience that or understand it, I recognize that they think so. The smart sociopath learns to mimic normal human behavior, learns to act as if they are going to believe in that need of others. They learn to behave the way that we expect a person with normal empathy to behave. But they're not feeling it. And what that means is that sociopath, confronted with an opportunity to cheat the system, will do so with no compunctions and no conscience. And they'll be very, very good at it because they've learned to mimic proper behavior. It is not a coincidence that a lot of the famous sociopathic killers of history, people like H.H. Holmes and Ted Bundy, are often reported as being extremely charming, very, very seductive, very, very good at persuading people, because they've had to learn to imitate that behavior to function. And they're cheating the system. and they can get away with a lot because they break the social contract in ways that others wouldn't even begin to suspect. And therefore, sociopathy gives them an edge. And the few biologists and psychologists who have studied this have found that psychopaths, on average, have more children than the population at large. And by the way, the incidence of psychopathy in certain professions, particularly doctors, lawyers, upper echelons of the business world, corporate CEOs, and politicians. Those are the professions in which sociopathy is most highly represented. Professions that we know benefit from ambition, right? And from a certain amount of ruthlessness. A sociopath can do really well in that kind of climate and can become a very successful individual. But here's the thing. Here's where negative frequency dependent selection comes in. It's only useful if it's rare. Because think about it. The social contract that you and I live every day, the basic hard-coded biological social system that we all believe in at some level, that says we are going to cooperate as a species in order to survive, says that we help each other, right? If you see an old lady fall down on the sidewalk, your typical response is presumably not going to be to kick her, grab her purse, and run away. Your response is going to be to help the old lady up, right? That's what we do. We help each other in little ways all the time, whether it's holding a door, helping a tripped old lady, whatever. We do that for strangers. We do it for kin. We do it for kin more than we do it for strangers, but we do it. We assume a certain level of social cooperation. It is a built-in requirement of being a society that that if I give you money at the grocery store, when you give the cashier money at the grocery store to buy your banana, the cashier is not going to punch you in the face, take your banana, take your money, and run. You know that if you call for help, you call for help because you have a reason to believe somebody will come. We need that as a society to survive. That's how we work as social animals. Every social animal works that way, whether it's a human, whether it's a flock of birds, whether it's a pack of chimpanzees. Sociopaths cheat that. And they succeed because it's not expected. The expectation of cooperation is broken, and therefore the sociopath can take huge advantage and do selfish things to give themselves a really big edge. And if they're smart about it, like I said, only the smart sociopath survives for long, they might get away with doing it for a long time before anybody notices. They might get away with doing it more than once. They might get away with convincing you that it was your idea. So yeah, sociopathy is quite advantageous as long as it's rare. Because if we imagine that 25% of the population is sociopaths, we don't know the actual incidence of sociopathy. You're probably all thinking, oh yeah, I know that ex of mine who was a sociopath. Probably not. They were probably just an asshole. But we think the incidence of sociopathy is like 2% in the population, something like that. But let's pretend for a moment that the incidence is 33%, that 1 in 3 people is a sociopath. Let's pretend that's the amount. If you knew that 1 in 3 people was a sociopath, if there was a 1 in 3 shot that grocery store clerk was going to take your money and not let you have your banana, would you even make that transaction? Probably not. Society would break down. If sociopathy was really common, the baseline assumption that your average individual around you was going to cooperate with you, would help you, would feel empathy with you, that would fail. So sociopathy loses its advantage if it becomes too common, because then all the things that let the sociopath get away with stuff go away. That societal structure that they're exploiting. Negative frequency dependent selection, folks. Only useful if it's rare. Make sense? All right, now shift gears. Let's talk about a totally different thing. There's one really important aspect of selection and of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium we haven't dealt with yet. The last thing that we haven't dealt with is that to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, you have to have random mating, right? Random mating is one of our basic criteria. Every individual is an equally viable mate for every other individual. In the real world, that's not the case. Populations have mate choice. Not every individual is going to be equally attractive to every other individual. So what governs that? Mate choice is a thing that Charles Darwin began talking about in his second book, The Descent of Man, in 1871. Well, it wasn't his second book, but his second evolutionary book. And there he stumbled into, well, he worked on a very important concept called sexual selection. Sexual selection is like natural selection, but what it's leading to is non-random mating. Sexual selection is selection acting specifically on traits that are related to reproduction. Traits that are not helpful to you for some utilitarian purpose in life, like being faster or having bigger fangs or being more resistant to this pathogen or whatever. These are adaptations that are specifically for helping you mate. Adaptations that are there explicitly for the purpose of making you more reproductively successful. Now, sexual selection can work in a couple of different ways. We can talk about intrasexual, I-N-T-R-A, intrasexual selection versus intersexual selection, I-N-T-E-R. Intrasexual selection means sexual selection for traits that make you a better competitor as opposed to other members of your sex. In other words, an intrasexually selected trait is one that makes me more attractive, or actually not more attractive, let's back that up. It's a trait that makes me better able to outcompete fellow male. It's basically making you outmuscle other members of your sex in mate competition. Now, outmuscle here, it sounds like it's actual physical shoving each other out of the way, which it can be, you know. Let's point out for a thing that sexual selection very often leads to two things. One, the development of sexual dimorphism, D-I-M-O-R-P-H-I-S-M, sexual dimorphism. And that's a situation in which the male and the female of the species have very different physical appearances. So they have structures or features that are going to be recognizably different, whether that means a difference in body size, whether that means ornamental features that one has or the other one does not have, that you can look at an individual and determine very likely if they are biologically male or female on the basis of obvious physiognomic traits, you know, that there are anatomical structures that clearly dictate the sex of the individual. Now, how about another thing that can happen out of this, a thing called secondary sexual characteristics. Primary sexual characteristics are the characteristics actually involved in the act of mating, the structure of the genitalia, the production of sex hormones, that sort of thing. Secondary sexual characteristics are features that distinguish you from the other sex but are not directly involved in the mating process. Ornamental features are often the case. In birds, for example, you'll find that the male bird in most species is the brightly colored bird. The bird with the big display of fancy feathers is probably the male of the species. Look at the peacock. Whenever you see a peacock with that beautiful fan of gorgeous, colorful feathers, that's the male. The female, the peahen as they call them, is much more drab and brown, and she doesn't have the big fancy tail feathers. Secondary sexual characteristics are things like that, features that visibly distinguish male from female, but are not actually directly relevant to the mating process. Look at our own species. Facial hair, you expect to be a feature that males have, right? Breasts are a feature you expect the female to have. You know, we have these features as well. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, these are traits that, although they're not directly involved in mating, they might make a potential mate more attractive, right? Now you're getting what sexual selection is all about. Intrasexual selection is whenever I've got a trait that helps me to outcompete my own sex. It makes me a more viable mate than another male because I get the other male out of the way in some fashion. I do better at getting to the opposite sex. Great example. Look at the racks of antlers on deer moose, elk, any kind of ungulate grazing animal with a big old rack of antlers. That rack of antlers is useful for defense from anything that's a threat, but it is particularly there for mating competition. Whenever it's rutting season, when the female deer are fertile and the males are inclined to seek a mate, you will find that the males physically compete with one another over mating access to females. Male deer will clash their antlers together. They'll fight with one another, physically fights over the female. Now, the thing about this is the male with the biggest, strongest antlers usually prevails in that fight. So having a big, strong rack of antlers is an example of intrasexual selection. I got these big old antlers that help me to outcompete other males. My antlers are bigger and stronger than yours. I'm going to compete with you. I'm going to get the female. That's intrasexual selection. It doesn't have to be an anatomical structure. It can be a behavior. For example, female lemurs exhibit what is called a dominance hierarchy, where there will be a dominant female that will chase away males from competing females. That there will be a hierarchy in the lemur troop where the dominant female will get first pick of the available males, and then other females will get pick of the available males in descending order of their place in the pecking order. And that dominance behavior, in which female will physically chase males away from another female or cut off her access to them or fight her off, that's a behavioral example of intrasexual selection, in which she is restricting mate access to other females so that she comes out on top and gets choice of the best mates. So those are behavioral examples. Let's use a human example, right? Let's be uncomfortable for a while. We're talking about evolution. We're talking about sex. We're going to get to the uncomfortable part of the class now. In humans, we have several features that are good for intrasexual selection, features that help a male to outcompete another male, female to outcompete another female. In the female of our species, girls listening here, how many of you have lived around another female about your own age, and after a while your periods start syncing up with each other, right? It's a thing that happens. There's a reason for that. The reason for that is because you, all of us, you, me, all of us, give off sexually attractive scents at all times called pheromones. P-H-E-R-O-M-O-N-E-S, pheromones. The pheromone is the scent signal that advertises your mating availability. And I'm here to tell you it plays a huge role in your mate choice. We're going to talk about that more in a few minutes here. Now, what's happening is that when a woman ovulates, she gives off a different pheromonal signal. Her pheromones change in a way that, although consciously we don't notice it, at a subconscious level, it advertises her mating availability. It's a way of sending out a scent signal that says, hey, I'm fertile right now. This is a good time to mate with me so that you get offspring. That's what the whole pheromone thing is. It's advertising. It's chemical advertising. Consciously, we don't know we're smelling it in most cases, but we sure as hell are. Now, here's the thing. The opposite sex is not the only one smelling your pheromones. Your own sex is as well. If you are living in the company of other fertile females, and your roommate is fertile when you're not, she's ovulating when you're not, that means that she's giving off a more attractive signal than you are that would pull in available males. Which means that the two of you, in comparison, all other things being equal, she will be more attractive to an available male in that environment. So what's the intrasexual selection? You sync up your period. Your body adjusts the timing of your period so that you are fertile at the same time as the competing female is fertile. That means that she's not got the edge on you, that you've synced up your period with hers so that for any available male in the environment, you're both an equally viable mate choice at that time. She's not sending out an advertisement chemically that you're not also sending out. That's a great example of intrasexual selection in our species. Do one for the male side as well, right? Let's make everybody uncomfortable. Any of you who have ever looked at or owned or experienced a penis? are aware that it has a distinct flared tip. The glands of the penis, glans, a flared tip portion of the penis, that kind of mushroom-like shape. There's a reason for that flared shape. The flared shape is there because it is a scoop. A scoop to pull away the sperm of a competing male. Let's first disabuse you of a notion. You're not a monogamous animal. Humans are not, nor have they ever been, monogamous as a species. We have a number of human cultures that like to pretend they are, but in reality they are not. Consider within our own culture that in surveys, a majority of both men and women admit to cheating on their partners even when they are happy in their relationships. A majority of both sexes. And those are the ones admitting it in the survey. We're not monogamous. We just like to act like we are. It's a cultural standard that somewhere in our past we decided monogamy was a good idea. It's pretty new, by the way. Sexual monogamy has only really been a thing in the Western world for about 500 years. But it's a thing that we are at least doing in this culture. 85% of documented human cultures worldwide are not monogamous and have some form of institutionally recognized non-monogamy that is considered socially acceptable. We're weird in the Western world here in considering monogamy to be the norm, when it is not the human norm at all. Now, getting back to that scooping action, what that means is that in a non-monogamous population, it is possible that the female has had another mate before you come along. That she may have someone else's semen already in her vagina. So what happens is you thrust in, use the hand motions here, right? And you encounter the other male's semen. The flared tip of the penis catches the semen, pulls it back out. Then you thrust in, pull more of that semen back out of the way, and when you hit your moment of climax, you thrust in as hard and deep as you can and fire yours in to replace what was just pulled back. That's intrasexual selection. Shape of the penis is designed to pull away the sperm of a competing male. And that is not a feature, by the way, that natural selection would have favored in our species if we were a monogamous animal. It would be completely useless if you were a monogamous animal. Now, let's talk about intersexual selection. Intersexual selection is going the opposite way. Intrasexual means I'm out competing the other guy. I've got a feature here that makes me somehow outcompete the other male or the other female. Intersexual selection is working on the principle of attracting the opposite sex, not outcompeting members of your own sex, but doing things to make the opposite sex like you better. A lot of things are like this. Look at birds. Birds are great at this. Male birds are most often the colorful ones. Big, bright, beautiful displays of feathers. When you look at a cardinal, the male is the bright red one, the female is the dull brown one. The male has the bright coloration as an attractant to the female. The brighter colored males with the most fancy feather displays tend to get the most mates. That is intersexual selection. It's a display feature. Lots of animals have display features, and it's almost always the male. Usually the male is the one with the display feature for intersexual selection purposes. The reason for that is quite simple. Males are easy to come by. Males are what we call at evolutionary levels the fast sex, meaning that males replace their sperm really, really quickly. One male can fertilize as many females as he can get access to because he can produce more sperm rapidly. Females are the quote-unquote slow sex, which means that once they have been fertilized, it takes them a while to gestate that young. They don't have the option of getting more young before the first one or first group is done. And therefore, at an evolutionary level, they're slower. They're investing more energy per offspring, and they can't produce offspring any more rapidly, whereas a male can produce offspring more rapidly if he gets access to more females. Given that, the bottleneck here is with access to the female, right? Therefore, it's the male who needs the attractive feature at evolutionary level. The male is the one who's going to have the display feature that attracts the female. This is not to say females don't have these. Female animals can have display features just like males can. In our own species, you're going to find that throughout the course of human history, And we are living also in a very weird society in that we're living in the first time in human history in which a female with a big, heavy, round body is not favored. Look at ancient prehistoric art. Look at the Venus of Willendorf, that Venus figurine of the woman with the big hips, the big butt, and the big breasts. That has been the figure that has been favored by human males worldwide for the overwhelming majority of human history, only really changed in the Western world in about the last 50 years. Because think about it. That rounded body feature means breasts that are able to nourish my young well, hips that are well equipped for giving birth, and fat stores that mean that you can keep that infant nourished while it's developing. That's why those features are favored. They indicate I'm a good mate because they indicate, hey, I've got the features that will make sure your young that you have with me survive and get fed and get born well. Likewise, the reason the female likes the male with the brightly covered feathers is because the male with the bright feathers and the good feather display is the healthy male. Think about it. When you see a sick bird, its feathers are all out of alignment, it's pale. When you see a sick person, that person is pale and pasty and doesn't look as good, right? Because whenever you're ill and your body is devoting resources to recovery from your illness, you don't have the luxury of spending energy on ornaments. And therefore, that's the first stuff to go when your body has to prioritize those things. So the display feature of the big, bright, brilliant, beautiful feathers or whatever is an advertisement to the female that is really saying, hey, I'm healthy. I'm good at finding food. I'm not carrying lots of parasites. I'm good at fighting off disease. Because the brightest males are the ones who have the resources to stay or to be bright that way. And so in that way, the female doesn't know she's selecting for better immune systems. She knows she's selecting for a color. But at the end of the day, the secret reason, you might say, is that the brightly colored one is the one with the better immune system. Likewise, the human male does not know he is selecting for good birthing hips and ability to feed the baby. He just knows he's selecting for the curves he likes. That's intersexual selection. I've already started getting some uncomfortable human examples. Let's give another one or two. Great little study was done in California involving pheromones. Again, pheromonal study research was big in Berkeley a number of years back. There was a wonderful study that came out of California that showed that strippers make more tips when they are ovulating. Because that stripper is giving off a pheromone signal when she is ovulating that says, hey, I'm sexually attractive right now. I'm fertile at the moment. You should want me. And the male picks up on that scent. He doesn't know he's smelling her scent. All he knows is he finds her real attractive at that moment. And so he tries to buy her favor. He gives her a bigger tip when she's ovulating than when she wasn't. Similar study done with a group of young women were allowed to mingle with a group of young men. They were allowed to hang out with them for a while and then rate which guy they found the most attractive. Then they were given shirts that were worn by those exact same men. Asked to smell the shirt and evaluate which guy had the nicest smell. Their choices for nicest smell, when they didn't know who'd been wearing which shirt, they were identical white t-shirts. They didn't know which guy had been wearing which shirts, but their choice for the best smelling shirts and the guy whom they rated as most attractive after hanging out for a while matched 93% of the time. It's all in the nose, because the guy's pheromone signal was what the woman was being attracted to. He was giving off a chemical signal. And incidentally, that human pheromone signal, you know what that's actually telling us? That's telling us about your immune system composition. Your scent is largely based on immune molecules called MHCs, major histocompatibility complexes. You don't need to know that. But the thing is, the more different my MHCs are from your MHCs, the more attractive we're going to find each other. Because the reason for that is that if we mate, we produce young that have both parents' immune qualities. In other words, if I mate with somebody whose immune molecules are really different than my own, that individual is going to give me healthier kids because that kid's going to benefit from my immune qualities and theirs. If I'm mating with somebody whose immune system is very, very similar to mine, we're not bringing innovation to the party. We're not giving as wide a range of resistances in the offspring. So we're more attracted to people proportionally based on how different their scent is from our own. We're going to find that even with kissing. You know what kissing is, guys? Kissing is tasting your partner. It's getting the pheromones directly through the mouth. And the person you call a good kisser is almost certainly the person who has different pheromones than you. Now, we're at 50 minutes exactly right now. Technically, I'm out of lecture time, but please just bear with me for another minute or two. I want to finish this out. But given that, that's the pheromone is an intersexual selective signal. It's attracting others, and really what it's attracting is it's saying, I have an immune system that has this particular chemical composition. You pick up on that scent, and the more different it is from your immune system, the more likely you are to find me attractive. You don't know what you're selecting for. You don't even consciously know the scent most of the time. Think about it, though. Whose scent do you know? You know the scent of a lover, right? You know the scent of the person you curl up in bed with. You know the scent of the person who you put your head on your shoulder and you smell that scent and it's comforting. We are sexually attracted to the people who have the nice scent, and nice is defined as pheromones different than my own. This is why nearly every society has an incest taboo, because we're not sexually attracted to people whose genetic composition is similar to ours because their scents are similar to ours. Make sense? That was a scent joke I just gave in there. Yeah, I did that thing. And a lot of the research on this, incidentally, is research that is in the hands of perfume companies and cologne companies who are learning how to work pheromones for the benefit of their product. And it is a frustrating thing to evolutionary biologists that a lot of the research on pheromones and scent is proprietary knowledge in the hands of companies as trade secrets, and they are not sharing. So I've told you what we know right now, but I assure you out there, the people making the perfume know more about this than you do, and they're using it to their best advantage. Incidentally, beard, chest hair in a guy, reason for that? Because the glands that secrete the pheromones, apocrine sweat glands they're called, are concentrated in a few parts of the body. And in males, they are found in the chest hair and in the hair follicles associated with the beard. And here's another one of those great intersexual selection features. Men with beards that are around fertile females a lot, a man who's living in the company of multiple fertile females, his beard grows faster because those apocrine sweat glands are shedding the pheromonal chemicals onto the shaft of the hair directly through the follicle. And therefore, by having more beard, you're aerating the chemical more, sending out a better advertising signal. So the more females that guy is around on a regular basis that are potentially available mates, faster his facial hair grows as a way of advertising his availability. Speaking of advertising, let's get even more uncomfortable. Think about it a moment, guys. Who do you expect to be louder during sex? You expect women to make more noise, right? In general? There's a reason for that. Female chimps do it too. Because here's the thing. When the female is receptive to fertilization, it is to her biological benefit to try to get fertilized, right? If the whole point of this thing is passing your DNA on and the female is ovulating, she wants to be fertilized. The moaning and screaming during sex, that's advertising. That's a way of saying, hey boys, party's running, come get some. Female chimps do it. They shriek and moan during sex, and the males all come running. And that female chimp will take several mates in a row, because the more mates she gets, the greater the likelihood she gets fertilized. The greater the likelihood that she will have that sperm get in there and she will have young. We're about 99% genetically identical to chimpanzees. It is not at all a surprise. We do this too. So yeah, you hear your neighbor moaning through the wall, in the next apartment over. Technically, that's a form of advertising. Technically, that is evolved as a mechanism saying, I am sexually receptive right now. Come have a child with me. I'm not recommending you go knock on your neighbor's door, and try to get in on that, unless you worked out some kind of arrangement with them where that's cool. But, I'm just saying that this is the origin of that. Intersexual selection, things that make you more attractive to the opposite sex. Have I made everybody sufficiently uncomfortable? because all this stuff applies to us just as much as the rest of the animal kingdom. One last point. Sexual selection is all about mating success, getting your DNA into the next generation. It has very little to do with survival. Survival's nifty. Survival keeps you around long enough to mate. But sexual selection is specifically for mate useful traits. And if your DNA gets passed on, as far as your DNA is concerned, your job is done once it's passed on. It doesn't much matter what happens to you next at a selection level, because your DNA is in the next generation. You won, evolutionarily speaking. What this means is that sexual selection will very often end up favoring traits that are not necessarily good for survival, but are good for reproduction. That male peacock with that big, beautiful display of tail feathers, the male with the biggest, brightest fan of tail feathers, is likely to get the most mates. The females dig that. That male is also the most likely to die young, because he gets those tail feathers tangled up in something and gets stuck, or because they slow him down and a predator gets him. So yeah, that big fancy tail feather gets him killed. But you know what? Before he dies, he has more young on average than a male with less impressive feathers. And therefore, selection favors the big, bright, beautiful feathers, even though they make you die young, because you're having more offspring. And the name of the game, I told you guys at the beginning of this unit, it's not survival of the fittest. It is reproduction of the fittest. Selection does not give a damn if you survive, so long as you reproduce first. Salmon swim upstream for days to get to their old spawning grounds. They arrive at their spawning grounds, they mate like crazy for a few days at a place where lots of other salmon are going to be, and they die of exhaustion. The bandicoot in Australia, the male will go into a mating frenzy in which he will not eat or sleep for as much as 2 weeks at a time. He'll go around mating with as many females as he possibly can until he keels over. These behaviors are obviously deleterious to the survival of the salmon and the bandicoot, but they're behaviors that are favored by natural selection because they mean you reproduce more. It doesn't matter that they kill you. What matters is that before you die, you have more young than another individual who isn't doing that thing. That's what sexual selection can lead to, folks. Sexual selection can lead to behaviors that kill you dead or make you way less likely to survive, but ensure that mating happens. Black widow spider, right? Female eats the male. He lets her do it because it nourishes his young with her. And he got the mating opportunity, and he wants to make sure his young survive. He died, but he just made lots of babies. And his DNA is still alive. And that's the name of the game in evolution. It's all about the perpetuation of your genetic material. Make sense? All right, folks, I've gone almost 10 minutes past the official end of lecture time. I appreciate you indulging me in that, but I wanted to kind of tie off sexual selection as an important concept. We've now been through the entirety of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. We've been through all the microevolutionary forces that are important at work here. One last thing I want to talk about relevant to this is the limits of natural selection, the things that selection cannot effectively do. But I've already gone nearly 10 minutes over what I'm supposed to have, so I'm going to cut this off. So what's going to happen on Monday, I want you all to come in with questions for me if you had any questions about any of the material we covered in this lesson. And in between sociopathy and sex, we had some pretty juicy content this time. So we'll have further discussion Monday if we need to. We will finish talking about selection by talking about its limitations, the things that selection cannot do. Then that'll be it for microevolution. I do not have a quiz or assignment on microevolution for you at this time. I will have one soon. Not going to be available till after we finish that discussion. But don't forget that you owe me another take-home quiz on selection if you've not given that to me already. Get it into my hands as soon as you can. Not on selection, on the fundamentals of evolution. Over the weekend that we're not here, work on your lab assignments from what I gave you on Thursday. Make sure that you are up to speed on everything that you might be behind on assignment-wise. Be ready with questions on Monday. And if you've not already done so, read the sections in your book on macroevolution and speciation. I think it's chapter 24. And be ready to talk about that because that's the next part we move on to. And that will actually finish off the evolution portion of the course, and we'll start moving on to talking about plants, animals, and other specific groups of living things. But I've talked enough. It's almost at the 1 hour mark. Good night, folks. See you next week.